Let's now head to the U.S. for our continued coverage of the 2024 U.S. election. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have battled across swing states this weekend, urging voters to decide in one of the most intense U.S. elections in modern history. Harris has encouraged Americans to turn the page on Trump's divisive politics, while Trump continues his push for a political comeback. With less than 24 hours until Election Day, close to 100 million early ballots have been cast, with more expected before polls close. Both candidates had rallies in North Carolina, while Harris addressed supporters in Georgia, and Trump made additional stop in Virginia. Harris continued her campaign in Michigan, while Trump plans rallies in Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And to talk about this, we're joined by U.S. election laws. To talk about the U.S. election laws and voting, we're joined by Henry P. Costa, politician and businessman, joining from Monrovia, Liberia. Let me kick off by asking what's the main federal laws governing voting rights in the U.S. and how do they work to protect voters across states?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I wouldn't call myself an expert on U.S. election laws, but across the 50 states and the territories, there are slight variations of the election laws. For example, in Pennsylvania, which is the number one swing state in this particular election cycle, they don't get to announce, or they don't declare early or begin to announce early voting results on election day. In states like Georgia, which is also very, very important, people get to, so there are variations of election laws. The United States is a mosaic. It's not, like a monolithic country like Nigeria or Liberia. So, but you're right, 78 million folks have voted already across the country, which is more than 50% of the people who voted in 2020. So these are record numbers that we're seeing.
But then do we have things like state-specific voting laws, differing in terms of early voting and also mail-in ballots and also same-day registration? What do these impacts have on voter turnout?
I think it makes it more convenient and it incentivizes a lot of people to vote early. So let's go back to 2020. Democrats were big on mail-in ballots or mail-in voting. And Trump was very much against it. He condemned it as a strategy to steal the election. But the Democrats took advantage because you remember now, this was COVID. Lots of people were getting sick. People were trying to restrict their access to other people or access to the virus. So people used it quite heavily. What we've seen former President Trump do this election cycle is that he's on the all out encouraging Republicans to use the mail-in ballot system, which he no longer now considers a fraudulent process. And so lots of people voted via mailing, and several states, a lot of states, allow early voting. Some states you have to wait until election day. So, it's not the same across the U.S. So those states that have allowed early voting and mail-in voting have seen record turnouts. It's incredible. 78 million people, the last time I checked, have already voted.
Let's take a look at Voting Rights Act, for instance, that of 1965. What role does that play in today's elections? And how have recent court rulings affected its enforcement?
Well, one of the problems, the greatest democracy on earth, has dealt with for a long period of time has been people, American citizens, being able to vote, to exercise their franchise in a conducive, free of restriction environment. And that has been a challenge. Why the Democrats have pushed, new legislation to grant people, to make it easier for people to exercise their franchise, The Republicans, on the other hand, have done a number of things, legislatively. For example, in the state of Georgia, they've instituted new reforms to make it more difficult for certain people, particularly people of color, to be able to cast their ballot. So it is a challenge. And the reason why it's a big challenge is there's not so much the federal government can do on a federal front, because the states reserve certain rights that they can institute at the state level. So in states that are Republican controlled, Republican led, you see more and more, bottlenecks and hurdles put in the way of people. And in states that are Democratic led or led by Democrats, you see easier access to voting. So the Republicans don't want a lot of people to vote. It seems the Democrats want a lot of people to vote. Yeah.
Now, talking about bottlenecks and challenges, how does, for instance, voter ID law vary between states, and what are the main arguments, for and against stricter voter ID requirements?
Well, there are some states, the states that make it easier. They have a shorter list of requirements. You can have a driver's license. You should be able to vote in some states with a driver's license. Some states would require your birth certificate. Some states would require your passport. And some of these documents, a lot of Americans don't quite travel outside of America quite a lot. And so a lot of them don't feel the need to have some of these documents handy. So they have all kinds of bottlenecks in place in some of these states, but some states make it easier for people to vote. And, a driver's license should suffice. A national ID should suffice. Whereas some states, they have a whole long list of documents that you have to present in order for you to be able to vote. They don't outrightly say you cannot vote, but it just makes it more difficult for people to vote.
Do you think security will play a role in this election, looking at recent changes in election laws addressed, and also can it heighten concerns around election security and, of course, voter access?
Oh, it's a big issue. As we speak, the last time we had, the U.S. had general and presidential elections was in 2020. That was when President Trump was in the White House. This time is President Biden that's there, and Kamala Harris is sort of the incumbent running for election. So already serious security measures have been instituted. They have barricaded the White House. They've barricaded Congress. They've done all kinds of things, instituted all kinds of measures on the federal and at the state level to ensure that people don't get to go berserk like we saw in 2020 and the months after the 2020 election. President Trump and his base, his MAGA base, have already started stoking fears. They've already started with stop the steal. We've seen in a number of places where frivolous lawsuits have already been filed against things that supposedly haven't even have happened, but in reality have not happened. He's preparing a stage to claim that the election was stolen if he's not declared a winner. That's what he's trying to do. So yes, a number of security measures have been instituted to prevent chaos. So, tensions are high. Very high.
Let's talk some more about level playing field and, of course, fairness. What are the current legal standards for voter roll maintenance, and how do states ensure these processes are fair and accurate?
Well, again, I don't know that much about the mechanical aspects or infrastructure, but all of the so-called fraud allegations that were brought in the wake of the 2020 presidential election were either frivolous at best or completely asinine at worst. And they were thrown out by the courts across the U.S. because they had no merit. I say this to say that the U.S. system is very, very, very solid. It's nearly foolproof. It has worked for decades and decades and decades, and they keep improving their systems. It's not an easy thing for somebody. It's not like, I'm sorry to say, like in Nigeria, when you had your last presidential election, people were saying, oh, they changed the voter roll. Like in Liberia, those kinds of allegations would, be made, and some of them would actually carry some substance or some iota of truth. But in the United States, it's hard to see where, one party could possibly rig an election in one state. It's very hard to see that happen. And they also have poll watchers, as we call them here in Liberia. Representatives of the various parties are represented. Agents are represented in the various voting booths or voting rooms just to ensure that nothing untoward is allowed to happen. So it's almost impossible, to see fraud take place, because the system is not manual. The system is digital, but there are layers of it that ensure that it cannot be tampered with. So there are several layers of security to ensure that there is free and fair election.
Now, still talking about security, do you think, the Department of Justice has a role to play in enforcing voting rights protections, particularly in states with a history of restrictive voting practices?
On the federal level, for example, there's a piece of proposed legislation currently before Congress. It's been there for a while. It's named, I believe, the John Lewis Voting Right Act or Voting Right Bill. That bill has been there for a while. Democrats have tried unsuccessfully to drive it through. But of course, with the Republicans controlling the House, it has failed, to pass. So the Democrats are constantly trying to improve that, but the legislation needs to be in place first in order for the Department of Justice, the DOJ, to enforce it on the federal level. But still, there's, the way the U.S. is structured, the states still get to have a loophole around that to come up with regulations or policies or laws to undermine federal laws that guarantee easy access to exercise one's franchise. So so the DOJ can do something, but only when the legislative or the legal framework is in place to make that possible.
Well, indeed, fingers crossed, like they say. We'll see how things turn out with the U.S. election. But many thanks indeed for your time on the news, Henry Costa, politician and businessman. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
The U.S. is amid yet another consequential election season, featuring former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. Many Ethiopians and Eritreans live across the U.S., with those in swing states wielding significant influence. In recent state elections in Georgia and Virginia, where numerous Ethiopian Americans voted Republican to protest the Biden-Harris administration, with a few remaining silent amid substantial evidence of genocide and ethnic cleansing in Ethiopia. At this rally in Washington, D.C., Ethiopian Americans voiced their support for Republicans. For News Central, international correspondent Afia Hagen has more.
Historically, Ethiopian expatriates favoured the Democrats, viewing them as champions of inclusion and multiculturalism. Yet this trend is shifting as the party increasingly embraces progressive ideologies seen as opposing religious and family values. Given that most Ethiopians, both Christians and Muslims, are religious conservatives, these stances have become untenable, prompting May to explore other political options.
Donald Trump, we want change! We want change!
As an African, we really value our family, our kids, and how they're raised. And right now with the school system and the way they're pushing the LGBTQ initiative down our throats, where we cannot even really, to be honest with you, opt out.
I'm voting Republican because the Democrats obviously have not honored the promise to the people. They have neglected the suffering of so many millions of people and not heard our voices over years and years of advocating and bringing forth the evidence of the U.S. government's corrupt policies and draconian policies against African nations.
As an Ethiopian American, from the geopolitical perspective, I think that the current Biden-Harris administration has been very neglectful toward the genocide that's been happening in Ethiopia, for instance. It happened under their watch.
If I'm not elected to Congress, I will still make sure that Congress...
Republican Congress candidate Jerry Torres has promised the American Ethiopian community that he is the best choice for them.
The United States gave, just as one example, $728 million to the Ethiopian government. They used the money to build a palace for the president, and then they bought 56 drones and was killing the Yomara people. And that money was not designated for that purpose. It was for humanitarian purposes. The Democrats have just given money to countries, and the dictators are using it for whatever they want to use it for. I mean, imagine this, even Iran, right? We give Iran money, they send drones our way or to Israel or other countries. And believe me, nobody wants a war. I want all wars, all killing to end. And I think that's what we can bring to the African continent, is the end of the little attempts at genocides, whether it's Central Africa, East Africa, West Africa, and support the democratic governments under there, because they're surrounded sometimes by dictatorships, and we don't even listen to what they said.
Whoever they vote for, it's crucial that the diaspora make their voices heard in this election. In Washington, D.C., I'm Afia Hagan for News Central.
And now let's cross over to Washington, D.C., where our international correspondent, Afia Hagan, is on the ground with the latest. Afia, just bring us up to speed. What's the latest from the campaign trail?
Well, the campaign trail today is really focused on Pennsylvania, and that's where Vice President Kamala Harris will be campaigning. She's making a few stops in this very important swing state. She is going to be starting off in Scranton, where she's going to be delivering opening remarks in a canvas kickoff, and then she's going to be in Allentown. Now, that is a really important area. It's a big Latino area, a really big Puerto Rican population there, and there she's going to be joined by legendary artist Fat Joe. Then she's going to be in Pittsburgh with her husband Douglas Emhoff, and then she is going to end the day in Philadelphia, the seat of government, I suppose a lot of people call it, in the United States. And there's going to be a big concert there. Fat Joe, like I mentioned, will be playing, as well as DJ Cassidy. Lady Gaga is going to be playing there as well. The Roots and Oprah Winfrey is going to be in attendance at that rally as well. It's billed as like a final concert of this election campaign. And Pennsylvania is a really, really important state. So important, actually, that Donald Trump is going to be campaigning there as well as heading to North Carolina and Michigan. Now, his campaign haven't released as many details of what he will be up to today, but it is all about campaigning in those very crucial swing states.
I know you mentioned Pennsylvania is very important in this election, but why is it so important in this election? Afia, I was asking why you mentioned Pennsylvania being so important in this election. Afia, are you there?
Yeah, well, Pennsylvania is the most important swing state. You get 19 electoral college votes. It's the state with the most amount of electoral college votes, and it's virtually impossible to win the White House without winning Pennsylvania. And that is why it is so crucial, and that is why it's so important, and why the campaign, both campaigns, have been there so many times. It's going to be Kamala Harris's 18th visit to Pennsylvania. Like I said, it has the most amount of electoral college votes at 19, and so it's hugely important to this election campaign.
Afia, just give us a sense or feeling of where you are, which is Washington, D.C. What's the feeling like right there?
Well, the the atmosphere here in Washington, D.C. is one of trepidation. I mean, where we are right now, around this area of the National Mall, is being heavily barricaded. Barricades that weren't here before when I arrived a couple of days ago have been put up, especially around the White House. And as we've been around town and talking to people, people are a little bit afraid. Shops are boarding up. Some shops closing early today and closing completely tomorrow. Some buildings already boarded up. And yes, people are around where we are now. Town is still relatively busy, but there is definitely a sense of trepidation. People worried about what could potentially happen today and into tomorrow. And that is all about what happened here on January 6th, 2021, when you had the Electoral College were certifying the vote and Trump encouraged people to riot and not accept it. Now, if a similar thing happens and Donald Trump encourages people not to accept the election result if it doesn't go his way, there are fears that there could be violence in the nation's capital. And so yes, a sense of trepidation, shops boarding up and lots of security in place.
Well, many thanks, Afia Hagen, our chief international correspondent, bringing us up to speed on preparations for the U.S. elections. Many thanks indeed, Afia.